Professor Philip Johnson, thank you for joining us today.
I'm glad to have you here with me.
Well, we're here in your offices at UC Berkeley. Tell us exactly what you do here on the campus.
Well, I'm a professor of criminal law. I teach criminal law, criminal procedure. I have textbooks out in those subjects. And I also teach legal theory, which is about the philosophy behind the law, how we know the difference between right and wrong, what should be legal and what should be illegal. These philosophical interests have taken my writing into some unusual directions. As you know, I'm the author of a well-known book about Darwinism. It's very critical of Darwinian science and philosophy. I've taken that writing to a more philosophical and cultural level in my latest book, which is called Reason in the Balance. So I have a varied career, you might say.
Are you actually a lawyer?
Oh, yes. I'm a member of the California Bar. I have been a criminal prosecutor, and I sometimes testify in court as an expert witness on professional responsibility, legal ethics, what lawyers can and cannot do, should and should not do. So I have a practical background in the law, although recently my interests have gone into more theoretical and scientific subjects.
What is life like on the UC Berkeley campus?
What is life like? Well, it's a very pleasant place. You see, it's a great university with a great tradition and a lot of different things in it. Many excellent academic departments of different kinds, a varied student body, a wonderful climate, beautiful scenery. It's a wonderful place. And you know, 30 years ago, or let us say 25 years ago, it was very politicized. There was a great deal of radical political activity, student demonstrations. And now this is much quieter. And while there is still a lot of politics, people are actually much more pleasant to each other today than they were then.
We hear some strange stories about this campus of crazy things that have gone on over the years. Do you have any favorite stories of some of the interesting campus activities?
Well, perhaps we had the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, of course, first. And then we had the great People's Park riots, when the university tried to take a vacant lot and use it for buildings, and there were riots, and it's still a vacant lot, and we have the homeless living there and drug traffic and so on. It's been going on forever. People all over the country always ask me about the strangest things. They ask me about the naked student. We had a male student who went naked to all his classes for a while before he got kicked out. But that didn't really get much attention on the campus. It was a New York story, you might say. So we have had many strange things. But you know, really, this is a university which concentrates on science, scholarship, hard work. These eccentricities are very much a side story, not the main story.
How many years have you been a professor here at UC Berkeley?
I came in the fall of 1967 when I was only 27 years old, so I'm going on 30 years. I've been here for some time.
Before your experience here at Berkeley, you were a clerk for a Supreme Court justice. Could you tell us what that experience was like?
Yes, I was law clerk to Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was the most famous Supreme Court Chief Justice of all time, I think, in America. He had been governor of California, a presidential candidate, unsuccessful, and then became the famous reforming Chief Justice who brought the principle of racial integration into the Constitution. So I worked at his right hand, you might say, writing legal opinions, doing the research, and so on under his supervision.
What did you learn from your time working at the Supreme Court?
Well, a great deal, I would say, about how that institution works, how it decides cases, how the justices relate to each other. Unfortunately, the court has changed much. My information is very much out of date. You know, back in those days, it was sort of a society of gentlemen. They were friendly to each other. They were very respectful and courteous. And there was a unity of approach, a kind of general agreement to a great extent. Now the justices are all going every which way. They write very long opinions, many of them in the same case often. I don't think it's as much fun for people now as it was then.
What is a typical day for you like here on campus in terms of interaction with students and classes and things like that?
Well, normally a professor at this university will teach on the average one-hour class a day in formal instruction. And then, of course, there'll be time meeting with students other than that. But the expectation of the university is that at least half of the time, when one is not teaching classes or in committee meetings, meeting with students in the office, is for research and writing. We are very much expected to be active participants in publishing and in scholarship, developing a national or a worldwide reputation in our subject. So I suppose that's probably the most important part of our life.
Is there a lot of pressure on you from the school administration to publish, to write books?
Oh, yes. You see, you are appointed, as I was in 1967, as an untenured professor. And then sometime, perhaps 4 years later, that would be very soon, or 8 years later, that would be later, a longer period, you are evaluated for tenure, for a lifetime appointment. And this is a very, very strict and tough standard. They want people to have published in a way that makes them at least have the promise of being a leading scholarly figure in that discipline in the whole country during their career. So there's a lot of pressure on for that. And then after you get tenure, it continues. You never reach a point where you can't be promoted to something higher. Just now I am being evaluated for the very highest rank and so on. So it goes on even for those at my age level.
You're probably best known for your work, Darwin on Trial. What did you learn about Charles Darwin that you maybe didn't know before?
Well, you know, the book isn't really about Charles Darwin as a person. Certainly one thing I learned about both Darwin the person and Darwinism, the movement, is that there was a great deal more philosophy to it, really, than most people imagine. See, the sense most people have is that if something is labeled science, well, that means it's fact. Somebody has seen it really happen. And yet, if you state the proposition that complex organs like my hand, your eyes, you see, your hearing, or even more impressive, a bat's hearing, you see, that it uses to navigate, that these things can come about by natural selection. No intelligence, no creator is involved, but just random mutations and natural selection. People will say, oh, well, that's fact, that's science, so people have seen that happen, they know that it's true. And yet, I was struck by how little real evidence of this there is, how much of it is presumption, how much of it is speculation. And that really fascinated me because the Darwinian understanding of things is very important outside the scientific community. It's important to ordinary people because it's the creation story of our culture.
What do you mean?
You know, every society, whether it's a tribe in the jungle somewhere or whether it's a modern nation, must have a creation story, a story of how we came into existence. This is at different levels. We have, in the United States, we have our social creation story about the Constitution, the War of Independence, you know, and so on. But I'm speaking of how we as people, as individuals, as human beings, came into existence. Now, when our country was founded in the 18th century, the universally accepted story that's reflected in all the literature of that time was that we are brought into existence by a creator, God, who has a purpose for our lives and who sets standards of right and wrong, who makes a purpose for life. Well, gradually in the 20th century, this has been supplanted by what I call the naturalistic story. People might say it's the scientific story, and the story of Darwinism. And this story says there's no God, there's no purpose behind things. It's just irrational. It's just chance. There's matter, and by chance combinations it combines, and then natural selection guides this because the fittest combinations of matter survive, and that's how we came into existence. So we can't say that God expects something of us because our real creator is natural selection. We make up the rules. We can decide to be whatever we want. Now, this has become the official creation story in this country, really in the last 30 years. About the time I've been on this faculty, you might say, maybe a little bit longer. And it's had tremendous social consequences that this has come to be accepted.
Professor, you're a very controversial figure. You have enemies on both sides. People in the religious conservative community are not always happy with you, and the scientific community is not very happy with you. How do you manage to make so many enemies?
I love my enemies, you see, because they get me involved in very interesting arguments and give me many challenges. So it's a very stimulating life. When I started out to write about Darwinism, it was when I was in London in 1987-88, and I had a sabbatical year, you see, so I had the time to take up this very interesting subject. I read a book called The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins, a zoology professor at Oxford University, who had started, by the way, at Berkeley here. He was an assistant professor at Berkeley about the time I started. I didn't know him, though. But he's an Englishman, and he's at Oxford now. And he wrote this fascinating book about, essentially, how Darwinism means atheism. You see, how it's called The Blind Watchmaker. And the title means that we're created by a blind, purposeless force, you see, not God. Well, I was really interested in the book because it was so brilliantly argued. And yet, as one whose specialty is in examining arguments and looking for the assumptions, I could see that it was carried by its assumptions, that the evidence wasn't impressive at all. That what was impressive was that he assumed the crucial points and then filled it in with illustrations and made a brilliant rhetorical treatment. So I became fascinated with this subject, and I read a great deal of the literature, all the literature available to the general public, and much of the professional literature. And at this point, I decided that the great confusion here in people's minds was that they thought that the debate between evolution, as Dawkins was propounding it, and creation was a debate about the Bible, about the Genesis chronology, you see, and is the earth only 6,000 years old? Was it created in 6 days? And that's what the debate was about. But I could see that that wasn't what it was about, really. It was not about whether a creator did it in a short period of time, but whether a creator was involved at all. And if Dawkins was right, a creator had nothing to do with our existence. Now that is a very much broader controversy, you see, than the question of the exact timing of Genesis. So when I wrote Darwin on Trial, I said, let's approach the subject this way. Let's put the Bible aside. We'll say nothing about it. We just put it aside and leave it out of the question. Let us look at the propositions of evolutionary science. Let us look at the blind watchmaker thesis. You see, I took that from Dawkins' book. Let us ask whether a combination of random mutations and natural selection really can do all this creating of birds and plants, animals, you, me, everything. And I showed how the evidence was very weak. Now, as you say, this surprised many of the biblical people because I was leaving the Bible out of it. But in fact, most of them have been rather accepting of that. They, after a little moment of shock, came to see that I really was getting at the main problem. I've also had a tremendous amount of opposition from the leaders of the scientific party, you know, the people like Dawkins himself, or Stephen Jay Gould, the Harvard professor who is the leading American Darwinist. And I've had arguments with them. But you know the people who are most upset with me? It is the Christian professors who have tried to convince themselves that Darwinism and Christianity are completely compatible. Because what I've done is to show the philosophical basis of Darwinism and that it is really atheistic to the core. Well, you see, this puts people at a difficult choice. They either have to challenge this ruling, powerful philosophy, you see, or else admit that their religion is intellectually discredited. Now, I think the ruling philosophy is very challengeable, and that's what I've argued both in Darwin on Trial and in my new book, which is called Reason in the Balance, which is more about the philosophical and cultural issues.
Is there something about your personality that you enjoy having lots of enemies? You like being in the center of the controversy?
I have to admit that I do enjoy it, that there is a certain excitement of standing in front of the large audiences, or really the most exciting audiences are small ones, seminars of professors, people that are really in the know on this. Of course, very often, the people that are debating against me or questioning me very angrily in the seminars are overconfident. They think, well, he's a lawyer, he's a law professor. How can he possibly understand all this detail in the biology and the arguments? And they find out that they're surprised that often I know more about it than they do. This, by the way, is not so surprising when you understand that many professional scientists are over-specialized. They know an enormous amount about the very narrow area that they're working on. But in terms of the general questions, which I am addressing, they really know what they remember from their college textbooks often, you see. So I often am correcting them on the facts. But the main advantage that I have in those academic debates is that I am used to looking at people's assumptions. You see, if you tell me something is true, I say, well, what are you assuming? You know, and what do you really mean by that? And the biologists are not used to doing that. They are used to accepting a common body of assumptions about reality. One of them is a materialistic philosophy, a naturalistic philosophy that says that, well, matter, nature had to be able to do its own creating because that's all there is. You say, well, if I ask them, how do you know that? They've never thought about that because within their own circles, nobody challenges that. So I bring an outsider's point of view to it. That's rather shocking to them. Some of them get very angry because of that. But we usually end up friendly. Maybe we go out for a glass of something afterwards.
What is Charles Darwin's place in history? Is he an important figure in history, and do we feel the effects of his ideas today?
Charles Darwin's a very important historical figure. If you ask any knowledgeable intellectual historians who were the most important figures in making the 20th century, in the intellectual sense, the minds who had the greatest influence, they will all name four people. There will maybe some others too, but the four names will be on every list of five, let us say. They are Nietzsche, the philosopher who said God is dead; Marx, the atheistic philosopher of society, of the social order; Freud, the atheistic philosopher of the mind; and Darwin, especially Darwin, who made it all possible by getting God out of nature, by saying we don't need God to create. You see, nature can do its own creating. So I think Darwin was, of all of the thinkers of the 18th or 19th century, the one who had the greatest influence on the 20th century. He really created the religion of the 20th century. And that religion played itself out in different ways in different countries. In Germany, Central Europe, Darwin's disciple Haeckel interpreted in terms of racial groups, social groups fighting each other. You see, that's the natural selection. And so we get German racialist philosophy. In Russia, you have Soviet Marxism. You see, it's the class conflict. And that was how the basic ideas played themselves out. In England and America, it was liberal democracy, relativist and free. The best of the alternatives, but now very much in crisis because it's lost its moral basis. So I think the 21st century will be very different, but Darwin was immensely important in the 20th.
What difference does it make in my life, for instance, if I choose to believe one or the other, one that things happen randomly or that there was a creator?
If the creator is real, then the most important kind of knowledge to have is knowledge of the creator's purpose and what the creator values, because that's what makes sense out of our own lives. But you see, if you become a Darwinian and then you understand Darwinian philosophy all the way down, profoundly, then you say, well, I just wake up. The creator is an illusion. Natural selection is the real creator, and natural selection has no purposes. So it's up to me. I can make up morality. I can make up right and wrong. We can change the rules. at any time. Now, on the one hand, this gives a sense of freedom. You say, we're not responsible to God anymore because God is dead. On the other hand, we lose a foundation for all of our decisions. And we see this in the cultural consequences in our educational system in the United States and in our legal system, that there's no grounding for anything anymore. Everybody just sort of does as they please. I believe that in some other countries, and probably this is the case in Japan, the consequences are not as severe because there's a stronger authority of tradition, you say. But America is not a country with a lot of tradition. It's a country where we make things up new all the time, and so ideas have more immediate consequences here.
You've also written an extremely controversial article with Terry Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize, and Charlie Thomas from Harvard in regards to AIDS. Can you tell us about that article and what your theory is?
Because I've been so involved in scientific issues and the philosophy of science, I've gotten to know a lot of people in the scientific world, and not all of them are against me, by the way. I have many friends and supporters there. One of the people I got to know was a colleague of mine here at Berkeley, a world-famous molecular biologist named Peter Duesberg, who has been virtually isolated from the whole scientific community because he is a dissident from the HIV/AIDS theory. Now, it's very complicated to explain this in just a moment, but I think the most important thing to understand is that the whole diagnosis of AIDS and that HIV, this virus, is the cause of it, was set at a press conference in 1984, before there'd really been any scientific publication on the matter. So before the scientific community really had an opportunity to think about it, a theory was set in concrete and has been unchangeable. Now, it's amazing how uncritical the scientists and even the newspapers are about this. You know that AIDS in Africa is defined totally differently from the way AIDS is defined in the United States. The virus is supposed to operate totally differently in Asia than it does in North America and Europe. In the United States, we've had no increase whatsoever, according to official figures, in the number of HIV-infected persons ever since they began testing for HIV. Yet we're supposed to believe that in certain areas of the world, especially the ones where records are kept the most loosely, that this virus is spiraling out of control and infecting more and more people every year. Well, this is only one of the many anomalies and unexplainable things that are involved in this theory. Now, one thing I've learned from my work with evolution, with Darwinism, and in this AIDS crisis, you know, the scientific people are very, very knowledgeable and very brilliant in their way, but they tend to work within a paradigm, within some master theory that is just sacred, you see, and you don't challenge that. And everybody just goes along with the program once it's set. So if you challenge the basic program, like my colleague Duesberg did, you become an outsider. They kick you out of science, even though you're one of the most famous scientists in the world. So I've been trying to help Professor Duesberg, together with the people that you name. We have Nobel Prize winners on our side. We have some very eminent scientific voices, but they cannot get a hearing because the politics of AIDS, the pressure groups, the patient advocacy groups, and the drug companies, the scientific researchers whose livelihood depends on this, I have managed to shut down all criticism.
So you and your colleagues believe that there is no connection between HIV and AIDS?
Well, that's probably not, but I don't want to insist on a complete set of answers at this point. My own position, after all, I'm a supporter of the biochemists who are dissenting from this, but I don't purport to have solved all the questions. It's simply clear to me that the various kinds of research that are done don't make any sense together, that there are many contradictions in the paradigm. HIV is either harmless or it's certainly not a super virus that can do things in Africa that are totally different from what it does everywhere else in the world. That the statistics about AIDS are grossly inflated by the people who are asking for money to deal with this. and that there's a real need for an independent voice, an audit of the books, as you might say. If telecasting this interview in Japan would inspire any Japanese scientists to say, let's take an independent look at this and not believe everything the American scientists tell us, that would delight me. And whatever answers they come to, I'm prepared to live with.
How has all the fame and notoriety of this book changed your personal life?
Well, you know, it's been kind of exciting. My wife and I have been involved very much with local things, with our local church. And my wife has a children's library in our basement with 20,000 volumes. It's like a public library, only it's just ours. And the children from all around the city come in and they check out books, and we have them around. And she does some other things like that, too, that I've been involved in supporting. But now I'm traveling a whole lot. With my new book coming out, I'm going to about 20 universities around the country. And I'm going, it now seems, to a big scientific meeting in Spain to address that in the fall. I'm taking leave from the university for the fall so that I can do that until the end of the year. And I'm constantly doing interviews, you know, like with people like yourself. So I've become much more of a public figure, and that's very exciting. What's particularly rewarding about it to me, though, is that I am able to give some leadership and some help to some young people, young scholars, people who are coming up with the new ideas that I think are really going to affect the 21st century, but who have a hard time getting started, you see, because things are very orthodox. The climate isn't receptive to these new ideas very easily. So I'm able to give them some help getting started. And that's the most rewarding thing to me, is when I can do that.
Professor Johnson, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure always to see you.